Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom Yerushalayim, Shalom, 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 Shalom Yerushalayim. Of Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem, pray for the peace. We continue our series on the highlights of the life of Jesus from a Jewish perspective, and we're dealing with this study in 5 major areas, and we'd like to complete the second main division and then move into the third. In the second main division, we've been dealing with the teachings of Jesus and the conflict with the Pharisees. And we now come to your outlines on page 24. We have the Messiah's denunciation of the scribes and the Pharisees. And primarily this covers Matthew chapter 23. Now I don't have to make references to the other gospel accounts in order to get everything we want to note from this passage. By looking at Matthew 23 as a base, and if you look at your outlines, you'll see all of the passages involved. With this lengthy denunciation of the leadership of Israel, he essentially closes his public ministry 3 years after it began. It began at Passover time, it ends at Passover time. And with this denunciation, he does close his public ministry because after this he works only with his disciples until his arrest, trial, and so on. Now we're going to divide our study of this section into 3 divisions. In the first section, looking at Matthew's account, verses 1 through 12, he is speaking to the disciples about the Pharisees, and he says 5 specific things. First of all, in verses 1, 2, and 3, the true nature of Pharisaic traditionalism is that of hypocrisy. Now when he says, they sit in Moses' seat, therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, but do not after their works, he's not saying that we are to follow all the rules and regulations of the Pharisees. As we've noted in this series, Jesus himself disobeyed them. Rather, by saying they sit in Moses' seat means they're in a position of determining case law. Like a judge sits on the bench and litigants come before him, and whichever way the judge decides between the litigants, then that is the decision of the court that has to be observed. That's the sense he's talking about here in the application of case law. But insofar as them innovating religious laws, these are not obligatory to be obeyed, but that is the nature of their system, that of hypocrisy. Secondly, in verse 4, they're guilty of making the Mishnah a burden upon others while they find ways to get around it. In verses 5 through 7, he points out that they are guilty of self-seeking and self-righteousness, and illustrates this by showing that when they did obey the Mosaic law, they took what the law commanded, but obeyed these commandments out of a wrong motivation. Rather than obeying them out of a love of God, the way we should obey the commandments of Jesus because we love him, they rather obeyed these commandments for the purpose of showing off their own religiosity. So, for example, he says they make broad their phylacteries. Now, the act of wearing phylacteries was in obedience to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verse 8. That was in keeping with the Mosaic law. That was the proper thing to do. But as he points out, they made these phylacteries unusually broad or big just to be seen of men. Secondly, it says they enlarged the borders of their garments. This refers to the tassels you still see Orthodox Jewish people wear. Here again, this is the proper thing to do as an obedience to the book of Exodus chapter 13, verses Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 12. This was a commandment they had to obey. That was not the problem. The problem is they enlarged the borders. They made these tassels unusually long just to be seen of men. And so essentially, they were guilty of self-seeking and self-righteousness. The fourth point he makes in verses 8 through 12 is that they love man-exalting titles. He points out in verse 8, they love to be called rabbi, teacher, master, and father. And these were titles of the pupil-teacher relationship. It merely being used as titles in of itself would not be so bad, but what happened in the development is that these titles gave the ones holding the title an unusual amount of authority over the disciple in his decision-making process, far more than the biblical principles would allow. And so they went after these man-exalting titles because of the authority it gave them. And so they were after these titles only for that purpose, and the disciple of Jesus must be characterized by opposite tendencies. The fifth point he makes is in Mark's account, verse 40, in that they are guilty of prostituting their religion, in that they use their long prayers to hide their covetousness, and their covetousness is seen in the way they foreclose on the homes of widows. The Mosaic law required special protection be given to the widows, and so a Pharisee would not foreclose on the home of a widow unless he prayed about it first. And so they were essentially prostituting their religion in that by means of prayer they hid their covetousness, and the covetousness is seen by the way they foreclosed on homes of widows. Now in the second division, where we come back to Matthew's account, verses 13 through 36, he now speaks directly to the Pharisees, and he pronounces 7 woes upon the Pharisees. These 7 woes are for various kinds of sins, but they form a circle in that the first and the 7th woe deal with the very same sin. The first woe is in verse 13. The first woe, they are condemned because they are rejecting his messianic claims, but secondly, they are leading the nation to reject his messianic claims as well. The second woe is in verse 15, for turning proselytes into even more zealous legalists. They went everywhere to convert people to Pharisaic Judaism. But often these converts to Pharisaism became even more zealous in their legalism. The third woe is in verses 16 through 22, and that is for switching priorities, in that they gave priority to the consecrated and not the consecrator. And he pulls out 2 examples. The first example is when he points out that they claim that when you swear by the temple, you don't have to keep your oath, but if you swear by the gold in the temple, then you do have to keep your oath. But what makes that gold so special? As to its basic makeup, it's no different than gold anywhere else in the world. What makes this gold special is where it was placed, in the Jewish temple. The temple consecrates the gold does not consecrate the temple. But in this system, they switch priorities. The second example he gives is that if you swear by the altar, you don't have to keep your oath, but if you swear by the gift or sacrifice on the altar, you do have to keep your oath. What makes that dead animal body unique? What makes it special as to its makeup is no different than any other slaughtered animal body anywhere else. What makes it special is where it was placed, on the Jewish altar. The altar consecrates the gift, not the gift the altar. But in this system, they switched priorities. They gave priority to the consecrated and not the consecrator. The fifth woe is in verse 23 and 24, which is for camping on the minors and ignoring the majors. He points out they're very careful to tithe mint, anise, and cumin. These were the 3 of the smallest seeds known in Israel in that day, and they were careful not to partake even of the smallest seed unless it was first tithed. And this was the correct thing to do. Jesus even says, this you ought to have done. The problem was not them doing this, but the fact that this was the focus, and they ignored the more important matters of the law, like judgment, mercy, and faith. And so they were guilty of camping on the minors, ignoring the majors. The fifth woe is in verse 25 and 26, and that is for being far more concerned with the external demands of the law and not the internal demands of the law. In that case, they are like someone who, after eating from a cup and a plate, washes the outside of it, but leaves the inside dirty. And your next meal will come from the inside, and that which is left before will defile the new food going in. And that's the problem with being far more concerned with the external demands of the law, not the internal demands of the law. Now, between the third, fourth, and fifth woe, 5 times he called them blind. The first time in verse 16, ye blind guides. Secondly, in verse 17, ye fools and blind. Thirdly, in verse 19, ye blind. Fourthly, verse 24, ye blind guides. And fifthly, verse 26, you blind Pharisee. And in this, Jesus is continuing a long prophetic tradition, in that as you read the prophets of the Old Testament, they consistently affirmed that it was the leadership of Israel that were leading the nation astray. Isaiah said this, Micah said this, Jeremiah said this, and many others. And in keeping with that prophetic tradition, because it is still true, Jesus also points out it is the leadership that is guilty of leading the nation astray, blind guides leading the blind. As we saw in the previous study, it meant both will fall into a pit. The sixth woe is in verse 27 and 28, which is for their hypocrisy. And he compares them with whitewashed tombs. Even today in Israel, every year tombs get a white coat of paint for the reason to become more visibly easy to see. Because if you are a member of the tribe of Levi and you are also a Cohen, a direct descendant of Aaron, you're not allowed to come in contact with a grave or tomb because that will render you ceremonially unclean. To make sure the Levites and Cohens could see these tombs quite readily, they are always given a white coat of paint to become very visible, so on the outward they look very beautiful, very clean, but inside it's full of defiling dead men's bones, and that is the nature of their hypocrisy, outwardly very religious, but inwardly defiled. When we come to the seventh and last woe in verse 29 through 36, he elaborates upon the first woe. And the point of the seventh woe is the guilty of rejecting the Messiah, as was testified of by the Jewish prophets. And so he says, for that reason, they will not only be held accountable for rejecting him, they'll be held accountable for all of the blood of the Old Testament prophets. Because by this time, everything the prophets were going to say about the coming of the Messiah had been said, and the Old Testament canon had been closed for well over 4.5 centuries. So to reject him as the Messiah automatically entailed with it a rejection of the prophets as well. You reject the Messiah, you automatically reject the witness of the prophets. Furthermore, they had the witness of John the Baptist proclaiming the soon coming of the King. And finally, they had the ministry of Jesus, who did not merely claim to be the Messiah. Anyone could do that. But he authenticated his claims with many miracles, signs, and wonders, including those ones they labeled as messianic. So in spite of all this, they rejected him. So Jesus declares they'll be held accountable for the whole body of revealed written truth. Now keep in mind that when Jesus used the Old Testament, he used it in the order of the Jewish Bibles, not in the order of the modern Christian Bibles. The number of books between the Jewish and Christian Old Testament is the same, but the order is not the same. Now in the Jewish system, the first book is the same, Genesis, but last book in the Jewish order is not Malachi, as most of you will be familiar with, but the book of 2 Chronicles is the last book in the Jewish order. If you look at verse 35, you notice he names 2 men. First he mentions Abel, found in Genesis, the first book. But he mentions a Zechariah found in 2 Chronicles, the last book of the Jewish order. And by naming these two men, he is saying they'll be held accountable for everything from Genesis to 2 Chronicles. It was a figure of speech meaning the whole body of revealed written truth, much as we would use a very similar figure today by saying from Genesis to Revelation. And what we mean by that is the whole body of revealed written truth. Then note verse 36. Verily I say unto you, all these things shall come upon, and notice those two words again, this generation. This generation, guilty of the unpardonable sin, would now also be held accountable for the whole body of revealed written truth. We come to the third division of our passage, verses 37 through 39. He closes the denunciation with a lament. In verse 37, he summarizes his 3-year ministry to Israel, how often he longed to spread his hands out and give to the holy city the messianic protection predicted by the prophets. But in the end, he said he would not, literally, he did not when they rejected his claims. So in verse 38, their house, the Jewish temple, is now destined to lie desolate. It will be destroyed 40 years after he spoke these words. But then notice that last verse, verse 39. Speaking to the leadership of Israel, he says, you will not see me henceforth till ye say, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord. And what he does in verse 39 is to lay down the precondition of the second coming. That particular phrase, blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord, was an official messianic greeting. The rabbis taught that whenever the Messiah comes, he must be welcomed with these words, for they come out of a messianic psalm in the Old Testament, Psalm 118 and verse 26. That same messianic psalm also prophesied, the stone which the builders rejected, the same is become the head of the corner. And so they would never use these words of Jesus till they first accepted him as the Messiah. So his point is this, that just as years ago the Jewish leaders led the nation in rejecting him, a day must someday come when the Jewish leaders will lead the nation in accepting him. And that is the basis of the second coming. He left the earth because of Israel's rejection. He won't come back to this earth until Israel's acceptance. That is the precondition to the second coming. So Israel's national salvation is the precondition to the second coming. Until, as Paul wrote, all Israel is saved, there is no second coming whatsoever. While the rapture of the church has no preconditions whatsoever, it could happen at any moment of time. The actual second coming to the earth for the purpose of setting up his kingdom does have a precondition, which is Israel's national salvation. Now, if we understand that point, we'll clearly understand the theological foundations of anti-Semitism and why there's always been this long, unending war against the Jewish people. Now, Satan, of course, knows that once Jesus comes back, then his career is over. But he also knows Jesus won't come back until the Jewish people ask him to come back. So if he can ever succeed in destroying the Jews once and for all, then Jesus won't come back and Satan's career is eternally safe. That's why Satan has always had a special war against the Jews. That's why things like the Crusades occurred. That's why things like the Russian pogroms occurred. That's why things like the Nazi Holocaust occurred. And that's why Revelation 12 says that once Satan is in the tribulation, confined to his fourth abode, he knows his time is short, and knowing it, he expends all of his energies to try to wipe out the Jews once and for all. Anti-Semitism in any form, whether it is active or passive, whether it is social or economic, political, religious, national, theological, racial, is part of the satanic bandwagon to keep Christ from coming back. Another thing we'll understand, if we clearly understand the basis of the second coming, is we'll understand why Satan used one name more than any other name to persecute the Jewish people. For about the 4th century, I would say 90 to 95% of all persecutions against the Jews was committed in the name of Jesus, name of the church, name of the cross. And Satan deliberately has used that name more than any other name to persecute Jews, because he knows that's the name they need to call upon to bring him back. And so he has set out a special emphasis, a special goal to make sure that they never use that name, to try to make the name odious in the Jewish community. And to this day it is odious in the Jewish community. And that's why there is such a tremendous negative reaction to Jewish people that accept Jesus. From the perspective of the Jewish community, this is not merely someone who changed his belief style. Rather, it is someone that has joined the ranks of the enemy who are guilty of killing Jewish people. And so that helps to explain why that name in history has been used more than other. It is part of Satan's strategy to keep Christ from returning. But the third thing we'll note from this is the importance of Jewish evangelism, and how important it is to both be actively involved in sharing the gospel with the Jewish people, but also be equally actively involved in supporting Jewish ministries to get the gospel out to the Jewish people. And I represent Aria Ministries. We have a twofold goal. Our first and primary goal is to win the Jewish people to Lord today. They can come to know their Messiah by putting their faith in Him, and by coming to faith now, they can escape some of the terrible days of the tribulation to come. We're also very well aware that a blindness in part had befallen Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. So we do have a second goal, which is to give the Jewish people a knowledge of what the gospel is. They may reject the message for now, but we believe that many of those who heard the gospel from us before the rapture will believe it afterwards. They'll number among the 144,000 Jews, who in turn can reach of Israel, who in turn will lead the nation to accept the Messiah, and that in turn will bring about the return of the Messiah. Now we'll pick up some more of these themes about what will bring him back and the circumstances when we conclude the series on the highlights of the life of Christ from a Jewish perspective, but this is as far as we'll go with it for now. So now let's go on to our third main division of our study, which has to do with the trial of the Messiah. And here we're going to see the tables turning a bit. And if you've been with us through these studies, you would remember that the foundational reason why they rejected Jesus as the Messiah was because of his rejection of their rules and regulations, the Pharisaic law system. In order to expedite his trial and death, they're going to end up breaking 21 of their own rules and regulations. Now on page 26 of your outlines and on page 27, where you begin Romans 3, you will notice it lists the laws of the Sanhedrin regarding trials. What I've listed here is 21 rules that are found mostly in the Mishnah that spells out how trials and arrests are to be conducted. These are not all the rules of a trial. There are literally hundreds of them, but these were 21 I've been able to pull out that were violated in the course of the arrest or the course of the trial. What I want to do is go through these 21 rules, and this way those of you that don't have the outline can at least hear what the rule is. As we go through it, I'll make a comment here and there, and then we go through the scriptures. We're going to see exactly where these specific rules and regulations were violated. So, for law number 1, there was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was effected by a bribe. This was pulled out of Exodus chapter 23, verse 8. Secondly, there were to be no steps or criminal proceedings after sunset, and the purpose of this rule was to avoid any conspiracy and using the cover of night to hide that conspiracy. So once the sun has set, you could not proceed any further with the legal procedures. And the sun officially sets in Jewish reckoning once 3 stars are visible. So once those 3 stars are visible, they could no longer proceed. Third, Judges or Sanhedrin members were not allowed to participate in the arrest. The purpose of this law was to keep them neutral. If they participate in the arrest, it means they've already taken sides. Law number 4 is there was to be no trials before the morning sacrifice. In other words, all of your daily morning temple rituals had to be out of the way before any trial could be conducted. Number 5, there were to be no secret trials, only public, again to avoid the problem of conspiracy. Number 6, Sanhedrin trials can only be conducted in the hall of judgment of the temple compound. Since all trials had to be public, it was necessary for the public to know where to go if there was a trial. And therefore, if there was a Sanhedrin trial, it had to be conducted in this one room called the Hall of Judgment or the Chamber of Hewn Stones in the temple compound. Also, you'll find it by its Hebrew name as the Gazit, G-A-Z-I-T. 7, the procedure was to be first the defense and then the accusation. This is the opposite of our Western system, but all of the reasons why a man could not possibly be guilty of anything had to be given before an official charge was actually presented by the 2 or 3 witnesses. 8, all may argue in favor of acquittal, all may not argue in favor of conviction. It was permissible to stack the deck in the accused's favor, but not against him. Therefore, it was all right for everybody to argue for acquittal. It was not all right for everybody to argue only for guilt. There had to be at least one defender of the accused. 9, there were to be 2 or 3 witnesses. The testimony had to agree in every detail, pulled out of Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 15. 10, there was to be no allowance for the accused to testify against himself. This was to avoid 2 possible problems. One possibility, the man might be suicidal and confessing to a crime he did not commit, or secondly, he was trying to cover up for somebody else and therefore confessing to a crime he did not commit to protect someone he happened to like or love. And therefore, he himself could not testify against himself. He could not be counted as one of the 2 or 3 witnesses for a trial to be conducted. 11, the high priest was forbidden to rent his garments, pulled out of Leviticus 21:10. In the Jewish community, the tearing of the clothing is a sign of the emotions, a sign of mourning. And for example, if a family member marries a Gentile, other family members will tear their clothing. A family member dies, other members tear their clothing. If a family member becomes a believer in the Messiahship of Jesus, other members tear their clothing. So because the facts had to be decided on the basis of the facts presented by the 2 or 3 witnesses, not on the basis of the emotions, the high priest was forbidden to rent or tear his garments during a trial. Number 12, charges could not originate with the judges. They could only investigate charges brought to them. This was for the same basic reason as number 3, in that it was to keep them neutral, and if the judges actually originate the charge, it means they've already taken sides. 13, the accusation of blasphemy was only valid if the name of God itself was pronounced. God's name in Hebrew comprises 4 Hebrew letters that will correspond to our English letters as YHVH. And those 4 letters, YHVH, make up the personal name of God. Unless you actually pronounce that name, you could not technically be accused of blasphemy. 14, a person could not be condemned on the basis of his own words alone. Again, you had to have those 2 or 3 outside witnesses. His own testimony against himself, even willingly, was not considered valid and could not be used as one of the 2 or 3 witnesses. 15, the verdict could not be announced at night, only in the daytime. This was to avoid a possible sudden rush to judgment and therefore issuing a verdict because you're tired. It may have been a very long day of questioning witnesses. People are getting tired. People are getting edgy. People are getting tense. Monday Night Football may be coming on fast. And so to avoid a rush to judgment, once those 3 stars are visible, they could not proceed. Even if they knew what the verdict was going to be, they had to wait until the next morning. Number 16, the cases of capital punishment, the trial and guilty verdict not occur at the same time, must be separated by at least 24 hours. The purpose of this rule was to allow for more time for more information to come in that would favor the accused. Number 17, voting for the death penalty had to be done by individual count, beginning with the youngest, so the young would not be influenced by the elders. By far, my favorite of these 21 laws is the very next one, number 18. A unanimous decision for guilt shows innocence, since it is impossible for 23 to 71 men to agree without plotting. The figure 23 is, the figure 71 is the maximum full membership of the Sanhedrin, but all 71 did not need to be there, but you had to have a minimum of 23. If you only had the minimum, it was even inconceivable among the Jewish people that 23 Jews could agree on one issue unless there was a plot involved. Now that was based upon the well-known observation that Jewish people enjoy arguing among themselves, and we talked about the development of the Mishnah, how they argued back and forth before they reached a verdict about a new rule by majority vote. There's an old Jewish joke that goes along with this law, and the joke is that when you have 2 Jews together, you'll end up with 3 opinions, and that law reflects that particular point. Number 19, the sentence can only be pronounced 3 days after the guilty verdict. While the verdict and the trial had to be separated by 24 hours, 3 more days would have to pass before the sentence would be issued, but for the same reason, allowing for more time, for more information to come in that would favor the accused. Number 20, judges were to be humane and kind, and 21, a person condemned to death was not to be scourged or beaten beforehand. Now again, these are not all of the rules of the Sanhedrin, but these are the rules that were broken either at his arrest or his trial. As I go through the arrest or the trial, I will point out exactly which of these laws were broken. So you want to go to page 28 of your outlines. We come to capital B, the arrest. And the gospel accounts we're dealing with here, for those of you that might not have an outline, is Matthew 26, verses 47 through 56, Mark chapter 14, verses 43 to 52, Luke chapter 22, 47 through 53, and John chapter 18, verses 2 through 12. And here again, I'll simply mention the gospel and then the verse without repeating the chapter each time. Now in John's account, verse 2, we read, "Now Judas also, which betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples." Now we already know from a previous passage of Scripture that Judas was bribed 30 pieces of silver to do the deed he's now doing. So this will break law number 1 on your list. There was to be no arrest by religious authorities that was effected by a bribe, and this one was. Then if you look at the end of verse 3 of John's account, it says they came in carrying thither lanterns and torches. All of this shows it is still nighttime, and that breaks law number 2 on your list. There'd be no steps of criminal proceedings after sunset. And if you look at Luke's account, verse 52, it also mentions that among the ones coming to arrest him are the chief priests and the elders. And these were 2 categories of members of the Sanhedrin. And so their presence at the arrest breaks law number 3. Judges and Sanhedrin members could not participate in the arrest. Altogether, Judas was needed for 3 reasons. He was paid 30 pieces of silver to do all 3 things. He'll accomplish 2 of these. He'll fail to accomplish the 3rd. The first reason why Judas was needed was to show where Jesus could be arrested apart from the multitudes. That's the function he is fulfilling here in John's account, verse 2. Having been a disciple of Jesus, he knew the habits of Jesus and knew one of these habits was that when Jesus was in Jerusalem, he would go to the Garden of Gethsemane for a period of prayer. Now, within the gospel accounts, this is the only record we have of Jesus doing this. But John verse 2 says Jesus oftentimes, many times, resorted thither. So it was a common habit of his, something Judas would know. The second reason why Judas was needed had to do with a point of Roman law. By Roman law, a Roman cohort could not be released to make an arrest until someone first appeared before the Roman governor, accusing someone of a crime punishable under Roman law. If you look at John verse 3, it says, Judas then having received the band of soldiers. And as your footnote should show, the Greek word for band is the Greek word for cohort. He received a Roman cohort, something he could not do unless he first appeared before the Roman governor and accused Jesus of a crime punishable under Roman law. Now you should also remember that part of the original conspiracy was that whenever they did this, they wouldn't do it on this night. Part of the conspiracy between the chief priests and Judas was that they would not do it at the time of the Passover. They would wait until the Passover was over, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims would return home, and then they would carry out this conspiracy. That was the satanic element in the conspiracy, because if Jesus had died any other time than the Passover, there would have been no atonement. And so while Satan wants Jesus to die, he does want him to die at this Passover. It was at this Passover that Jesus was destined to die by the plan of God. And that's why in Luke's account of the Last Supper, Jesus says, with desire have I desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. Galatians 4:4, in the fullness of the time, God had a set program and Jesus was destined to die at this Passover. Satan knew that. And so while he wants him to die, but he doesn't want him to die at this Passover, and so part of the conspiracy was they wouldn't do it on this night. When Jesus observed the last Passover with his apostles, on 2 occasions he identified Judas as the betrayer, forcing their hand. At that point, Judas left the Passover well before it was over. He reported to the chief priests, informing them that Jesus knew of that conspiracy, and probably afraid that he might escape out of Jerusalem. They decided to act that very night, though they didn't want to act that very night. Now, normally, Pontius Pilate was stationed in Caesarea, but he always came up to Jerusalem with his legions to help maintain order during these festivals, which made it convenient. And so they took Judas to Pilate. Judas accused Jesus of a crime punishable under Roman law, and he was then given the Roman cohort. That helps to explain 2 things that come up in the trials. First of all, when the Jewish trial begins, as we shall see, things are unorganized. There seems to be disorganization, anarchy, don't have the witnesses ready to go, and they don't. Remember, they never expected to have to do any of this on this night. Secondly, it helps to explain why, although it's the very wee hours in the morning, Pilate is dressed and ready to conduct the trial. He was anticipating conducting a trial because he had earlier released the Roman cohort, and so Judas does fulfill the second function. The third reason why Judas was needed had to do with another point of Roman law. Now, Judas was not needed for the Jewish trial, but he will be needed for the Roman trial to serve as the prosecuting witness. A Roman trial had to begin with the prosecuting witness presenting a specific charge. As we shall see in this study, he will fail to fulfill that third function. Altogether, there was a sizable group of people coming in just to arrest one man. And if you look at all the scriptures, there's 4 different groups of people coming in to arrest him. First of all is the Roman cohort. A Roman cohort consists of anywhere from 400 to 600 men. So you have a minimum of 400, as many as 600 Roman soldiers, but they are not alone. In Luke's account, verse 50 mentions a second group of one, the servant of the high priest. This was the crucial hours between the first night of Passover and the first day of Passover. And during that period, the high priest could now leave his compound lest he become ceremonially unclean and would not be able to offer the special Passover sacrifice on the first day of Passover. And so, as a result, the high priest himself did not involve himself in the arrest, but he sent his servant to make sure things went well. In Luke verse 52, the third group, which we already talked about, is mentioned, the chief priests and elders who are Sanhedrin members. And again, their presence breaks law number 3. But there's a fourth element mentioned also in verse 52. He talks about the captains of the temple. This was the Jewish temple police. Now, in the outer court, you could have Gentile soldiers stationed to maintain order, but no Gentile could go into the inner court of the temple compound, as there was an order of Jewish police called the captains of the temple stationed there in order to maintain order within the inner court. And they too are part of the arrest. So we have a sizable number of people coming in just to arrest one man. Now, if these soldiers were true to form, then they were carrying a sword, which is the yard-long battle sword. It was about a yard long, rather broad. It was not used in battle to thrust someone through. It was too heavy for that, but to bring down upon the head of the enemy. Because of its weight and sharpness, it would crack both the helmet and the skull. So keep in mind that they may very well have been carrying this yard-long, very broad battle sword, a point I'll come back to in a few moments. Looking at John's account again, when this very large party comes into the garden to arrest this one man, Jesus very quickly takes the initiative. At the end of John's account, verse 4, he says, "Whom seek ye?" And in verse 5, they answer, "Jesus of Nazareth." And then Jesus said to them, "I am." Now, the way it reads, "I am," you can take it in two different ways. One way to take it is that this is the "I am Jehovah" of the Old Testament, the one who revealed himself to Moses as the "I am that I am." The second way to take it is the simplified "I am he," I am that one you're looking for. Now, Jesus will say "I am" twice. The first time he says "I am," it will mean the "I am Jehovah" of the Old Testament. The second time he says "I am" will be the simplified "I am he," I am the one you're looking for. Here in John verse 5, he says "I am" for the first time. And after John's editorial comment that Judas was standing in the group, notice what verse 6 says, "When therefore." And remember, whenever you see this word "therefore," find out what it's there for. Therefore, for the very specific reason he said unto them, "I am," they went backward and fell to the ground. But by saying this one phrase, "I am," one word in Hebrew, he forced the entire group right down to the ground, showing clearly who was in control, showing clearly that he will not be arrested until he permits himself to be arrested. And that's why we know that this is the "I am Jehovah." It's a display of his deity. And one word alone is sufficient to cause them to fall right down to the ground. We have a small hint of what is yet to happen in the future at the time of the second coming, when the power of Rome will fall to its knees at the feet of the King of the Jews. After showing clearly who was really in control, in verse 7 he again asked them, "Whom seek ye?" Again they say, "Jesus of Nazareth." So in verse 8 for the second time he says, "I am." But this time means the simplified "I am he," I am that Jesus of Nazareth whom you're looking for. So he adds, "Therefore, for the reason that you're seeking me, let these go, let these other disciples go, since I'm the one you're looking for." So by now, Jesus clearly had identified himself to the group twice. Now, Mark's account, verse 44, you will notice that Judas already made arrangement with the leader of the Roman guard that they are not to arrest anyone until they see who it is that he kisses. And only after he applies the kiss upon a specific person in the garden are they to proceed and to arrest him. Now, Jesus already identified himself twice, and so there is no need for Judas to proceed with the kiss. However, he insists on earning his keep. The end of Luke's account, verse 47, says he drew near unto Jesus to kiss him. He approached Jesus to apply the kiss. But even before he had a chance to do so, in Luke verse 48, Jesus warned him against doing so. Judas still insisted. And so in Mark's account, verse 45, we read, he came to him and said, Rabbi, and kissed him. As your footnote shows, the Greek tense means he kissed him several times, kissed him many times, or kissed him much. It wasn't just the one kiss, he kissed him a number of times. And what Judas is doing here is profaning something that was then sacred among the Jewish people. The kissing of a rabbi was